The laughter around the dinner table sounded like glass cracking. Sharp, polite, and breaking all at once. My hands were wet, the mop heavy with spilled wine, and every eye in that perfect Richmond dining room was on me. The scent of roasted lamb mixed with bleach as I stood there, realizing I'd somehow become the evening's entertainment. If you're watching this, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hand you the mop and call it love. That was the night I stopped being silent just to keep the peace. The room went silent except for the sound of glass against porcelain. I stood in the middle of my daughter's dining room, holding a mop, the smell of spilled wine and bleach mixing in the air. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Friends of hers, business associates of her husband, people I'd cooked for, smiled at, served without complaint. They watched as my daughter told me to clean up the mess I made. Her voice was calm, polite even, but it cut deeper than a scream ever could. I remember the way my hands trembled as I bent down, the mop sliding over the floor while laughter returned in careful bursts, as if nothing had happened. No one met my eyes. That was somehow worse. I'd spent years keeping peace, folding my pride small enough to fit into the quiet corners of their home. I told myself it was love, that mothers are meant to endure for the sake of family. But that night, the truth was impossible to ignore. I wasn't part of their family anymore. I was the help. The shame burned through me. But underneath it, something else stirred. Something hard and clear. That was the night I stopped being the woman who kept quiet just to keep the peace. People think moments like that come out of nowhere, but they never do. There's always a trail, a slow, quiet unraveling that leads to the moment you finally see things for what they are. After my husband passed, the house in Roanoke felt too large for one person. The rooms echoed with his absence. My daughter, Lauren, called every few days then, kind at first, insisting that I shouldn't live alone. When she and her husband Ethan offered their guest room in Richmond, I told myself it was temporary. I thought I could help them. Maybe feel useful again? Those first months were full of gratitude. I cooked dinner, folded laundry, watched their golden retriever while they worked late. I told myself it was a blessing to hear footsteps in the hallway again. Lauren was driven, always checking her phone, always planning the next promotion. Ethan had a way of charming a room. Easy laughter, polished manners, a voice that made you feel like you mattered. For a while, I believed he meant it. Then, small things began to change. My envelopes started paying for their groceries. When the car broke down, I wrote a check. Later, I began covering part of the mortgage just until they caught up. I told myself it was family. That's what family does. But each time I gave, I felt something being quietly taken. The dinners grew shorter. The laughter disappeared. I started noticing the looks. The way Lauren's tone hardened when I forgot to wipe a counter. The way Ethan sighed when I offered advice. What I once called helping began to feel like paying rent on affection. I would stand at the sink late at night, rinsing dishes while they watched television in the other room, and wonder when I had become invisible. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow fading. Respect first, then gratitude, then love itself. I stayed because I thought loneliness was the worst thing a person could feel. I thought loneliness was painful until I learned what humiliation felt like. The night of the dinner still plays in my mind like a film I can't stop. Rewinding. The house gleamed under soft lighting. Silverware polished. Wine glasses lined like crystal soldiers. It was Lauren's big evening. A dinner for Ethan's investors. She wanted everything perfect, and I wanted to help. I'd spent the day roasting vegetables, arranging flowers, ironing napkins until my back ached. When the first guests arrived, laughter filled the house. But it wasn't the kind that came from joy. It was too sharp, too measured. The sound of people performing. I moved quietly, refilling glasses, clearing plates, staying out of sight. I told myself I was proud. that I was helping my daughter's life run smoothly. But beneath that, something uneasy stirred. The way Ethan looked at me, polite, detached, as if I were staff, made me feel small in a home I had partly paid for. It happened in a blink. A woman's elbow caught a glass, and red wine bled across the tablecloth. The guests froze. Ethan smiled that practiced smile of his and handed me the mop. My name never left his lips. Just a gesture, a silent command. I remember the sound of the mop hitting the floor, the soft thud echoing louder than any voice. I bent down, my hands shaking, the smell of wine and bleach rising up as conversation cautiously resumed. No one helped. No one met my eyes. Lauren looked away, her face fixed in that professional smile. She didn't defend me. She didn't even flinch. In that moment, I saw myself clearly, not as a mother or guest, but as something useful, disposable. Years of swallowed words and quiet sacrifices condensed into that single humiliation. I'd told myself I was keeping peace, but peace built on silence is just control by another name. When the last car pulled out of the driveway, I washed the last dish and climbed the stairs to my room. The laughter downstairs had long faded, leaving only the ticking of the kitchen clock and the heavy sound of my breathing. That was the night something inside me shifted. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the walls I'd dusted 100 times, and I knew this was not my home anymore. I didn't cry. I just decided. The next time I picked up that mop, it would be the last. The house was still when I woke, the kind of silence that follows a storm. Too calm, too clean. Downstairs, the faint smell of wine still lingered, a reminder of what had been spilled and what couldn't be taken back. I moved through the hallway barefoot, the wooden floor cool under my feet. Every step felt lighter than it had in years, like my body finally understood what my mind had already decided. I didn't rush. There was no need. The decision had already been made the night before. Somewhere between the laughter of strangers and the sound of a mop scraping the floor, I opened my closet and began to pack. A few clothes, my husband's old watch, the photograph of our wedding day. The frame was cracked at the corner, but I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. On the top shelf sat a small wooden box, dark walnut with a brass latch. Most people would have thought it sentimental, but it was more than that. I'd been keeping it for years, not out of nostalgia, but out of habit. My husband used to say that truth has a way of saving you if you're smart, enough to hold on to it. He was the kind of man who kept records, phone bills, letters, even the smallest receipts. After he passed, I started doing the same. I ran my hand across the lid, feeling the grooves of the wood, the faint smell of cedar. Inside was the part of me no one saw, the part that noticed, remembered, and quietly prepared. I didn't open it. I just smiled to myself, knowing it would speak for me when I no longer could. Before sunrise, I carried my bag to the car. The air was cold, sharp against my skin. The house behind me looked peaceful, but I knew better. Some peace is just silence holding its breath. I left the box where it would be found, not as revenge, but as truth waiting for light. Sometimes survival isn't running away. It's knowing exactly when to walk out and leave a trail that burns behind you. It didn't take long after leaving to see the full picture. The truth had been sitting there all along, waiting for me to open my eyes. Every uneasy feeling I'd brushed aside. Every time I'd told myself I was overreacting, it all made sense now. Ethan wasn't helping me manage money. He was helping himself to it. It started small. A missing check here, a strange withdrawal there. I'd written it off as forgetfulness. Then one afternoon, I noticed a transfer to an account I didn't recognize. My name was on the paperwork, but the signature wasn't mine. That was the first crack. I didn't confront him. I'd learned long ago that people like Ethan thrive on confrontation. They twist it until you start doubting yourself. So instead, I began to watch. Quietly. I kept a small notebook hidden in my drawer. Every payment, every check, every withdrawal went in that book. I learned how to log into online accounts, how to save screenshots, how to trace where the money went. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Ethan had rerouted part of my husband's life insurance and even set up fake investment portfolios under my name. He'd been slowly siphoning off thousands, disguising it as property expenses and insurance fees. I remember the night I heard him on the phone, his voice low, laughing about how easy it is when they trust you. He meant me. That was when my grief turned into something else. Not rage, but resolve. I started keeping a second record. Digital copies of everything, backed up and labeled under a different name. I bought a small recorder and placed it in the kitchen drawer where he often made his calls. Over months, I gathered every detail: transaction logs, voice clips, copies of signed documents. I made sure each one had a date, a trace. That wooden box everyone thought was sentimental? It wasn't. It held a hard drive, an envelope of statements, and a list of names, people he'd borrowed from, lied to, used. But that box was only the decoy. The real evidence was stored under my husband's name in a safety deposit box, downtown. Ethan could search every inch of that house and never find it. I sometimes think about my husband's voice, the way he used to say, "Always keep your own records. Maggie, truth is only power if you can prove it." He'd been right. When I left that house, I didn't just walk away from humiliation. I walked toward justice. Ethan thought I was just an old woman with shaky hands. He never realized those hands were writing his downfall. Truth doesn't always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like exhaustion, like standing in the middle of the wreckage and realizing justice doesn't rebuild what it breaks. The call came 2 weeks after I left Richmond. A detective's voice on the other end thanked me for what I'd turned in. He said the documentation was extensive, that it painted a clear picture of financial fraud. I listened in silence, staring out the motel window at the parking lot, the hum of the vending machine drowning out everything else. It was finally happening, but it didn't feel the way I thought it would. By the end of that week, word spread, Ethan had been questioned, then taken in for embezzlement and forgery. The same man who'd smiled so confidently at that dinner table now sat behind glass with reporters waiting outside the courthouse. His company froze its accounts. Investors pulled out, and the story hit the local papers. Richmond entrepreneur accused of defrauding family. Lauren's name was mentioned once, carefully, as his spouse. I saw the photo of her walking beside him, her face pale and hollow. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. That was my daughter, proud, successful, and broken in a way that reminded me too much of myself. I'd hoped the truth would free her. Instead, it stripped her bare. Neighbors whispered. Friends pretended not to know the details, but spoke them anyway. I kept to myself. No one knew I was the reason the investigation had started, and I didn't correct them when they speculated. The satisfaction I'd expected never came, just a quiet ache that felt both earned and unwanted. That night, as I stood by the window of my small apartment, I watched blue and red lights flicker in the distance from a nearby patrol car. It reminded me of that final moment in the house. The same silence, the same heaviness. My husband once told me that truth doesn't rush. It moves slow, like water through stone. But it always finds a way. He was right. The truth had found its way, but it had washed everything else with it. I turned off the light and stood in the dark, wondering if peace ever feels clean once it's come through justice. For a while, I thought the story ended with me. One man's betrayal, one family's shame, but it didn't. Ethan's lies reached far beyond my living room. They threaded through bank accounts, business deals, and promises he made to people who trusted him just like I once did. I first heard about it on the news, sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment. The headline was clinical, almost cold. Investment firm under investigation for large-scale fraud. But the details cut deep. Ethan's company had been operating like a shell, using false paperwork and fake portfolios to lure investors, retirees, young couples. Even one of his own business partners had lost everything. The same charm that once won me over had blinded dozens of others. The police later said he'd been running the operation for nearly 7 years. I thought back to the dinners, the expensive wine, the vacations he bragged about. All of it was built on money stolen from people who believed in him. I should have felt relief that justice was spreading wider, but instead, I felt a quiet sorrow. My pain was no longer just mine. It belonged to a crowd of strangers who'd been used the same way. What struck me most was how many of them said nothing for years. They noticed inconsistencies, excuses, missing numbers. But like me, they'd stayed quiet. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't want to believe. Silence isn't neutral. It's a thread that holds the web together until someone finally pulls. Ethan's arrest didn't just expose him, it exposed how easily kindness and trust can be twisted when people fear conflict more than deception. Sometimes the truth doesn't save just you. It saves the people who come after you. Lauren came to see me 2 weeks after the sentencing hearing. She didn't call first. I just opened the door, and there she was, smaller somehow, her shoulders pulled in, her eyes swollen from too many sleepless nights. She stood in the hallway like she wasn't sure she had the right to step inside. I let her in without a word. The air between us felt heavy, full of everything we hadn't said. She sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten toast alone every morning since leaving her house. Her hands trembled when she tried to hold her coffee cup. I didn't fill the silence. I wanted her to have the space to face what she needed to face. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked. She told me she hadn't known, that she thought Ethan was ambitious, not cruel, that every warning sign I'd ever noticed, she'd buried under pride and love. Watching her unravel, I saw the daughter I used to know. The one who cried when she lost her first job, who used to call me for recipes, who trusted too easily. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her it was all right. But it wasn't. Not really. Some wounds don't close with words. I just listened, letting her grief wash over the room until it quieted into something softer. When she looked up, I saw the question in her eyes. Not forgiveness, but whether I still loved her. And I did. That was the hardest truth of all. Love doesn't vanish when trust does. It just learns to live differently. We didn't hug. We didn't cry together. But when she left, she touched my hand. A small, trembling gesture that felt like both apology and promise. After she walked away, I stood by the window, watching her car disappear down the street. The apartment was silent again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. Sometimes collapse isn't destruction. It's the sound of truth finally taking up space where lies used to live. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about peace, the kind that finally settles in your chest when you stop waiting for an apology. Ethan is in prison now. The news stopped covering him months ago, and the world has already moved on. Lauren is seeing a therapist and rebuilding, one quiet day at a time. She calls sometimes, not to talk about the past, but just to ask how I'm doing. I can hear the weight in her voice, but also a small light, the sound of someone learning to breathe again. As for me, I found a new rhythm. My mornings are simple: a walk at sunrise, a cup of coffee on the porch, tending to the little patch of garden behind my apartment. I used to feel invisible. Now I value the quiet more than anything. Silence no longer feels like punishment. It feels like freedom. I've come to understand that justice isn't handed to you in a courtroom. It happens in the small, private ways you choose to live differently. By setting boundaries. By forgiving without forgetting. By trusting yourself again after being made to doubt everything. Sometimes the greatest justice is reclaiming the life someone tried to take from you. And when you finally do, when you stop living in reaction to what was done to you, that's when peace starts to grow roots. Looking back now, I don't see a story about betrayal anymore. I see one about endurance, about what it means to lose everything you thought defined you, and then quietly rebuild from what's left. I've learned that truth doesn't always come in bright moments of revelation. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in the stillness after the noise has faded. Forgiveness, too, isn't something you give for someone else's sake. It's what allows you to move forward without carrying their shadow. To anyone who's ever been dismissed, used, or silenced, you are not weak for surviving. You are proof that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to break. Healing isn't quick. It bends and circles back. But every time it does, you rise a little steadier. If my story teaches anything, it's that no one's pain is wasted if it leads to truth. What hurt you can also refine you. Thank you for listening to my story. If it reached something in you, share it. Speak your truth. Or simply take a moment to breathe and remember that you still have the power to begin again.